If you would go ahead and be turning to Matthew chapter 14. Matthew 14. That's where we're going to be here in our study here this morning. Matthew chapter 14. As you're turning there, I'll bring up this list of studies here. I was sitting there trying to figure out approximately where we need to be in our studies of the Gospel of Matthew before we leave at the end of May. And at one point I calculated we had 17 chapters, and I think it was like 24, 25 classes. And then I went to calculate today and realized if we want to finish Matthew before we leave at the end of May, we're going to have to pick it up about a chapter at a time. Looking at the book of Matthew here, we're in chapter 14 this morning. Then Wednesday, we'll try to cover 15. Sunday's our gospel meeting, and so we'll take a chapter at a time. At some point, we have to go drive down to look for a house, so I don't know when that'll be, but I've just allotted 2 classes gone for that time frame, and that would mean that the final Sunday we can do a review. So we're going to try follow this. We do have an extra class built in if we have to spend a couple of classes on one chapter, but our plan is to try to finish the entirety of the Gospel of Matthew on either on May 31st or May 27th, and we can review the 31st. So we're going to hit the ground running this morning with chapter 14 and trying to get through all of chapter 14 here and get into 15 on Wednesday. So we get into the book this morning. Our outline of the Bible, the Faith Life Study Bibles that we're following. We've got the prelude to Jesus' ministry in 1:1 to 4:16, the ministry in Galilee in 17 through 16:20, and then Jesus in Jerusalem 16:21 through 28:20. So that's the outline we've been following. This here is the 7 periods of the life of Christ. We're in that period known as the Great Galilean Ministry. That period technically ends here in our study this morning. When I say it technically ends, you'll find some people that outline the ministry in Galilee for more than where we are and talk about his ministry through chapter 18. I think it's Butler in his outline that goes through 18. That's because Jesus is still in Galilee, but it's what is sometimes called the period of retirement. There's not quite as much done. You'll notice in the chapter today, what does Jesus try to do with the crowds there? After the feeding of, or even before the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus is trying to get away from and spend some time either praying by himself or spend some time with his apostles. And so that's often called the period of retirement before we have the close of ministry. Our chapter content, chapter 1, the genealogy and birth of Messiah. Chapter 2, Messiah as a child. Chapter 3 is the forerunner. Chapter 4, the Messiah's temptation and early ministry. 5, 6, and 7 is the Messiah preaches the Sermon on the Mount. Chapter 8, he performs miracles. Chapter 9, he performs more miracles. Chapter 10, the call of the 12 apostles and the limited commission. Chapter 11, messengers from John sent to the Messiah. Chapter 12, the Pharisees find fault with the Messiah. And chapter 13, the Messiah tells parables. I know that's a really quick review through the earlier part of the Gospel of Matthew, but again, we're trying to get into chapter 14, finish that up here this morning. Again, 15's on the back table. If you haven't picked that up yet, you can do so as you leave here this morning. And then our meeting is Sunday, so I'll try to get you 16, perhaps try to get a couple chapters ahead by Sunday to get you your outlines. We'll see how that goes, but at least try to get you 16 either Wednesday or on Sunday for the next Wednesday. Chapter 14 we'll title, The Messiah Performs Miracles and John Beheaded. A summary of the chapter is 2 major sections. John's beheaded, that's the first section. And the second is the miracles performed by Jesus. So we've got the feeding of the 5,000, the walking on water, and many are healed by touching him here in this chapter. Question number 2, what's the key verse of the chapter? Verse 33, then those who were in the boat came and worshipped him, saying, truly you are the Son of God. Let's go to question number 3 real quick. Why was John cast into prison? He told Herod he couldn't have his brother's wife, and so because of that, he was not happy with him, put him into prison, would have done more except for fear of the people, and then eventually does do more. Question 4, why was John beheaded? Herodias' daughter danced for Herod. It pleased him. He told her he'd give her whatever she wanted. She went to her mother, who said, ask for the head of John. And so Herod gives it. So John's beheaded in 1 through 12. In verse 1, at that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus. Let's pause there for just a minute. Herod would be over the region up here of Galilee, as well as this area over here in Perea. He's over those territories. This is not Herod the Great. We've heard of Herod the Great. You hear talked about in history. He occurs earlier in the book. This is one of his sons who has his brother Philip's wife. Verse 2, he said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He's risen from the dead, and therefore these powers are at work in him. At this point, he doesn't know yet who this is. And we don't yet know at this point in the story about John's death. Last we heard of John, he's preaching about Christ, and then he baptizes Christ, and then he's heard of later on again when he sends messengers to Christ for them to ask if Jesus indeed is the Messiah. That's the last we've heard of John. But when we come down to the story, as it occurs and as is told here, John is beheaded because of what he said to Herod. Well, Herod here in chapter 14 fears that this is John back from the dead, and so it seems he wants to go and hear from Jesus. By the way, if you go over to Mark's account, as you read through Mark's account, it seems Herod, while he arrested John, Herod had some respect for John. And in fact, Herod would actually go and listen to John and his teaching. I'm jumping ahead of myself a little bit. Herod's a coward. And so Herod arrests John. Herod wants to put John, part of Herod wants to put John to death, but he doesn't for fear of the people. So then he's changed his mind now. It seems perhaps changed his mind having listened to John as well as his fear of the people. But then, when Herodias and her daughter ask for him to behead John, he does so. He just sort of goes whatever way the wind blows. Seems to be the way that Herod is going to go. So, verse 3 and 4 tells us why he was arrested. For Herod had laid hold of John and bound him and put him in prison for the sake of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife, because John had said to him, it's not lawful for you to have her. And although he wanted to put him to death, he feared the multitude because they counted him as a prophet. And so, as we mentioned earlier, he doesn't put John to death initially for fear. By the way, as the king, as Herod the Tetrarch is one ruling over this area, if Herod thought the right thing to do was to put John to death, then what Herod should have done was what? Put him to, if that's what he thinks the right thing to do is, it's what he should do. But he's just more concerned about what people think than about what he thinks is right. Same thing again later on in the text. Now we have the story about how he came to be beheaded. So again, Herod puts him in prison in 3 to 4. But he doesn't want to put him to death, verse 5, for fear of the people. But verse 6, when Herod's birthday was celebrated, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. Therefore he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. And she, having been prompted by her mother, said, give me John the Baptist's head here on a platter. And so she comes and dances for Herod. And it pleased him, and so he says, you know what, ask whatever you want, and I'll give it to you. So she goes and asks her mother, and she says to ask for John the Baptist's head on a platter. And the king was sorry, verse 9, nevertheless, because of the oaths, and because of those who sat with him, he commanded it to be given her. I learned something in verse 10. I know from verse 7, it says he promised her an oath to give her whatever she wanted. But it seems verse 9, he says, because of the oaths, that it seems he promised her multiple times, ask and I'll give it to you. And maybe she hesitated, no. Now ask whatever you want and I'm going to give it to you. And then he said, ask what you want and I'm going to, time and time again, I'm going to give it to you. And so because of the oaths, he did so. So he sent and had John beheaded in prison, verse 10, and his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. Then his disciples came and took away the body and buried it and went and told Jesus. So the disciples come now, get the body of John after he's beheaded and take it and bury him, and then they tell Jesus. Let's go to question 5 now before we move on to section 2. Question 5, what are the miracles in this chapter? 3 miracles. Feeding the 5,000, walking on water, the healing of many who touched his garment. So let's go to verse 13. When Jesus heard it, he departed from there to a deserted place by himself. So when he heard about John, he goes away, and now we're back in the timeline. After John's beheaded, John's already been in prison. For John's beheaded, here's what Jesus did. He goes to a deserted place. If you go to Luke chapter 9 and then verse 10, Luke's account tells us, in Luke 9 and in verse 10, he goes to Bethsaida. Now, some of your maps will not list this. Some will. There's actually 2 Bethsaidas. There is a Bethsaida of Galilee that's over here near Capernaum, and there's a Bethsaida up here of Julius that's over more on the north side of the Sea of Galilee. It's this Bethsaida over here that Jesus comes to, it seems, Bethsaida Julius, more on the northeast side of the Sea of Galilee. Keep that in mind for something we're going to get to later on. But this is where Jesus is, Bethsaida, when the feeding of the 5,000 takes place. Luke 9:10 tells us that's where he went. So he went to depart from there to a deserted place by himself. But when the multitudes heard it, they followed him on foot from the cities. And when Jesus went out and saw a great multitude, he was moved with compassion for them and healed their sick. And when it was evening, his disciples came to him saying, this is a deserted place, and the hour is already late. Send the multitudes away, that they may go into the villages and buy themselves food. But Jesus said to them, they do not need to go away. You give them something to eat. And they said to him, we have here only 5 loaves and 2 fish. He said, bring them here to me. Then he commanded the multitudes to sit down on the grass, and he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he blessed and broke and gave the loaves to the disciples, and the disciples to the multitudes. So they all ate and were filled, and they took up 12 baskets full of fragments that remained. Now those who had eaten were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. This isn't in your questions, but what is unique about this miracle over all the other miracles in the Gospels? Well, it reached so many people. The biggest thing, excluding the resurrection from the dead, it is the only miracle recorded by all 4. All 4 gospel accounts record this. Obviously, the resurrection has to be referenced. But in terms of the miracles performed by Jesus during his earthly ministry, this is the only one that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all record. So they all record this miracle. We know Jesus here in this text is healing the sick, and it's getting late, and the disciples say, send the people away. And Jesus says, you give them something to eat. Imagine being one of the disciples there for a minute. You don't have anything really to give to eat. And he says, you give them to eat. And you look out and see this vast crowd that, again, verse 21, were about 5,000 men. So keep this in mind. When we talk about the feeding of the 5,000, they only counted the men. That doesn't count the women and children. Let's just say, and I think this is probably a very conservative estimate, but let's just say for every man there was either one woman or child. So 10,000 people. Perhaps it's less than that. Perhaps it's more than that. We might have 15,000, 20,000 people. We might have 7,500 people. However many it was, 5,000 is impressive enough, much less any more than that fed with 5 loaves and 2 fish. We know from the other accounts of the gospel that it was a young man there that had the 5 loaves and 2 fish that gave it to them to give to Jesus. He blessed and broke it and gave the loaves to the disciples, and they gave to the multitudes. And everybody there ate until they were filled. And when they were filled, the disciples went out and they gathered the scraps. They gathered leftovers from everybody there. They ended up with 12 baskets full of fragments that remained. They ended up with more left over than they had to begin with. Yes. You're right. And again, as you think about that, this story here is after Jesus hears about John. So it seems that the beginning of the chapter is actually perhaps later on than this, as it's the reaction that is had by Herod to what he's hearing about Jesus. But in this case, Jesus is performing this miracle, and in fact, we know from John's account, they all want to follow him now because they're concerned about this physical bread, not spiritual things, which he has to remind them of. Let's go down to verse 22. Verse 22, immediately Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side. So that is what we read here in Matthew's account. They went to the other side. If you go to Mark's account, in Mark 6 and in verse 45, it says they went to Bethsaida. But wait a minute, we just said they are in Bethsaida. Remember, there's two. So there's Bethsaida over here, Bethsaida of Julius, but there's Bethsaida of Galilee. Again, it's not on the map. I've written it in here, but it's between Tabgha and Capernaum, approximately close to the shore, would have been where Bethsaida of Galilee was. John's account in John chapter 6 and in verse 17 says they went to Capernaum. Now, they went either to Bethsaida or Capernaum. Here, they're both close together. They, being the way the accounts record, likely went to Capernaum and as well to Bethsaida of Galilee. That's where they're headed. That's where they're being sent. But look in Matthew's account now, in verse 24. But the boat was now where? In the middle of the sea, or midst of the sea. John's account in John 6 would tell us they're about 3 or 4 miles. Now, from up here at Bethsaida all the way over here to about Capernaum and Bethsaida of Galilee, approximately 8, 10, somewhere in there miles. You've got the scales down here. I'll back up where you can see the scale. You've got the scale down here of about 5 miles. So this would be approximately 4 miles. They're somewhere in this general region up here. They're not close to shore. They're in the middle of the sea. Now, as they're in the middle of the sea, in the fourth watch, or they were tossed by the waves, for the wind was contrary, and now in the fourth watch of the night. The fourth watch would be between 3 and 6 a.m. Matthew 14 tells us the fourth watch. It's based off the Jews' time. That would put it between 3 a.m. and 6 a.m. Between 3 and 6 a.m., it's very dark. And so they're out on the sea. It's dark around. They're being tossed about. Not the first time they've been tossed in the sea. By the way, for some of these men on this boat, they are experienced fishermen. They probably got caught in some storms they didn't intend to, as well as these 2 storms they've been caught in here while following Jesus. But here in this text, they're caught in the storm, and then Jesus is coming out to them walking on the sea. Now, I don't know what they thought or how the plans were originally, at least in their minds, but Jesus is staying behind and they're going on ahead. He's having some time to himself. They probably thought he'll catch another boat in the morning or in a couple of days, and he'll join us over at Capernaum or Bethsaida. He'll join us over there somewhere. Except Jesus comes to them in verse 25, walking on the sea, and the disciples saw him walking on the sea. They were troubled, saying, "It is a ghost," and they cried out for fear. I mean, again, it's 3 to 6 o'clock in the morning. It's dark around. It's already storming. You ever heard a storm where the wind howls and you want to know what's out there, and then you look out and you realize it's just the wind? But now imagine you're in the sea and the wind's blowing, and all of a sudden you look out and there's some figure coming towards you. No wonder they were scared. And then they cried out for fear. But Jesus said, verse 27, spoke to them saying, "Be of good cheer, it is I, do not be afraid." So he tells them now who's coming to them. And so verse 28, Peter answered him and said, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." So There are 3, maybe 4 miracles within this sort of miracle, if you will. A miracle just means something that's contrary. It's really just something that's going to be sort of contrary to the natural law or order of things. We use the term miracle today, and it's used very freely. I remember several years ago, there was I've seen a lot of plays through the years, but there was a football game in the playoffs. They call it between the Minnesota Vikings and the New Orleans Saints, and they called it the Minneapolis Miracle because they scored with a few seconds left. That wasn't a miracle. The guy caught the ball, the defender fell down, and there was nobody between him and the end zone. That didn't require divine intervention. There was just open field in front of him. That's not a miracle. But in our society, it's often used that way. And I've seen a number of things dubbed the miracle of something through the years. But there requires something of sort of some law of nature being broken, if you will. One of those would be walking on water. You don't walk on water yet. Jesus is walking to them on water. Here's the second. Peter says to him, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. So Jesus said to him, verse 29, come. And Peter came out of the boat. He walked on the water to go to Jesus. There's the second miracle. Not only can Jesus walk on water, he can make Peter walk on water to him. Peter says, if it's you, let me walk to you. And he can have Peter walk on water. Now, when that is Peter, saw the wind was boisterous, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, saying, Lord, save me. So Peter starts by getting out on the boat, or getting out of the boat and walking on the water. Peter seems pretty brave at the beginning, and now all of a sudden the storm's raging around him, and he looks around, and now he becomes afraid. He cries out, Lord, save me. Jesus stretched out his hand and caught him and said to him, oh, you little faith, why did you doubt? Now, this is why I say there's 3, maybe 4. There's some debate. Is Jesus literally, physically grabbing Peter at this point, or maybe it's used more in the sense of Jesus saying, he may not yet be to Peter. We don't know. So there may be a third. This may be the third miracle in the text. It may not be. But either way, there's at least 3 because we've got Jesus walking on water, Peter walking on water. And then verse 32, when they got into the boat, the winds ceased. That for sure is the third miracle. Much like what happened earlier in Matthew chapter 8, I believe it was, where Jesus said, peace be still, the storms cease around. He would have known, yes, so perhaps he did. As you said, it's a supposition we have. It did. It had some purpose, whether it was because they were in a storm, whether it was to teach them. Because again, here are disciples that just saw Jesus take 5 loaves, 2 fish, and feed over 5,000 people. And so they just saw, that's a miracle. You can't feed people and then be satisfied. You can't feed 500 people, much less 5,000 plus people off that. Yes, and had the leftovers, and so they saw that. They should have believed then, but it seems they did not. He says to them, verse 31, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And so when those who were in the boat, verse 32, he gets in the boat. When those in the boat saw it, that the storm stopped, they were amazed, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." That being our key verse. They now come to recognize, you know what? You are Son of God. Remember, later on in the text, in John's account, at the end of the chapter, the bread of life passage, Jesus turns to the crowd and tells them to desire the bread of life. The crowd's reaction is they leave, but he turns to the disciples and asks if they want to go. And Peter says, "To whom shall we go? You alone have the words of eternal life." They've come to understand, at least to some extent. Now, we'll go ahead and skip these for time's sake. Let's get down to the next verse 34. When they crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret. Now, this whole area here is known as the plain of Gennesaret, likely referenced more in somewhere between Capernaum and Magdala in this range of Chinnereth. Likely the area they went. Somewhere in that area is the area known as Gennesaret. Again, the Sea of Galilee is sometimes known as Lake Gennesaret or Gennesaret. And so they're off the lake, and they're in that sort of plain there, somewhere in that plain. In the text, when they come there, and when the men of that place recognized him, they now recognize Jesus. They sent out into all the surrounding region and brought to him all who were sick. So they go out and they tell everybody Jesus is here. So they bring everybody that's sick and bring them to him. And they begged him that they might only touch the hem of his garment. If we can just touch the hem of his garment, then what? We're going to be healed. And so they begged to do so, and as many as touched it were made perfectly well. And so he comes now to this region. They come to him, and he heals them here in verses 34 to 36. That's chapter 14. I know that's a hurried look, but again, if we want to finish it, the Gospel of Matthew, we're going to have to go a little bit quicker through these latter chapters. So Lord willing, on Wednesday, we're going to be in chapter 15. That's on the back table. Again, next Sunday, it's our gospel meeting. Then we'll pick up on next Wednesday.